New details about the accusations against an East Texas state representative. Earlier this week, State Representative Bryan Slaton was accused of having an alleged inappropriate relationship with an intern. The latest report from the Texas Tribune references details of the complaint filed against the lawmaker. The report says a state capitol staffer claims Slaton had sexual relations with the intern 2 weeks ago. Since the complaint came to light, as many as 3 Texas lawmakers have called on Slaton to step down. Just this week, a bill was drafted in the Texas Senate that would target members of the legislature who engage in grooming behavior with victims under the age of 21. The Texas Republican represents House District 2, which includes Hopkins, Hunt, and Van Zandt counties. Last month, Slaton made headlines when he filed House Bill 4129, which would ban drag shows in the presence of minors in order to, quote, stop the sexualization of our kids. The House General Investigating Committee, which has the power to conduct inquiries and draft articles of impeachment against lawmakers, is investigating these allegations.